as we dive into God's Word, first I want to ask, it's a sort of a holiday that was 10 days ago. Does anyone happen to know by chance what it was? Think back. All right, I'll give it to you. It's Groundhog Day. See, we're not good on crowd participation yet. It's okay. We'll work on it. Give me some more weeks. We'll figure this out. It's Groundhog Day. It's observed every year on February the 2nd. Here in the States, the tradition is deriving from the Pennsylvania Dutch. The belief is this, right? If the groundhog emerges from his hole, right, and if he sees his shadow, then the winter is going to go on for another 6 weeks. Right? But if he comes out and if it's cloudy and there's no shadow there, spring is going to arrive early, right? So the holiday is probably a stretch, right? But it's at least a tradition. It's something fun that happens. I saw a joke 10 days ago on the 2nd, and it said this. It says, if the pastor sees his shadow on the 2nd, that the current sermon series will continue for 6 more weeks. And so, not giving away the punchline, I went to Pastor Jonathan on the 2nd. I said, hey, by the way, have you seen your shadow today? And he said no. And I said, good news then, that means our former series of Song of Solomon ended on its scheduled date. We didn't add another 6 weeks to it. That was when we planned in. We finished Song of Solomon last week, and so today we're beginning into the book of Ecclesiastes. The book is well known for its opening line that we're going to look at today. It says, vanity of vanities, or perhaps you've heard it said, right? Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. In 1993, the movie Groundhog Day was released, right? It starred Bill Murray. Anyone seen it? We're working on the participation. Not as many of you as I thought. All right. So Bill Murray, he plays Phil Connors. He's a television weatherman. He's sent to cover this Groundhog Day celebration. He goes there to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. This is where the famous Punxsutawney Phil is, that we all wait to see if his shadow is going to be seen. Once he's there, he begins to relive the exact same day over and over and over again. No matter what he does, there's no consequences for his actions. He wakes up again just like it was the day before on February the 2nd. Every day he has now become meaningless. And so he's stuck in this monotony. He's going through the same things, and so he starts looking for happiness in different experiences that he could have. One day he's binge eating. Others he's seducing women. Sometimes he's getting drunk. One day he robs a bank. Eventually he decides to start turning to knowledge. He begins to learn how to do ice sculpting and to write French poetry, and he learns piano. But in the end, he finds that all of these continue to leave him unsatisfied. They've not given him any extra meaning. He even attempts to take his own life multiple times to escape from this monotony. And yet, he wakes up again, February 2nd, Groundhog Day. The curse is only broken in the movie when he becomes content in his current life circumstances. I think the film serves as a perfect example of the world that we live in today. A world that says, if I could just blank, then I would be happy. If I could just have this thing, I would be satisfied. But when we don't find it, we begin to look for other escapes. We look for distractions, maybe substances, pleasurable experiences. We invest ourselves deeper in our work, or we begin accumulating possessions for ourselves. The book of Ecclesiastes is considered to be wisdom literature, and so through this book, we're going to dig into these exact topics through our series in this book. We're going to see God's wisdom and design for addressing them, but today, we're kind of setting the scene. We're getting to wrap our heads around what is this book and what does it mean. So we're going to look at 3 different things. We're going to look at the author. We're going to look at some definitions or some themes that we're going to see, and then we're also going to look at the author's opening arguments. So let's dive in. I'm going to begin reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and it goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuit the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, And what has been done is what will be done, and this is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of latter things yet to come among those who come after. This is the word of the Lord. If we look at the author, this is verse 1. It says, the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. So the best clues we have for authorship of this book is coming from this opening line. First, point out that the author gives himself the title preacher. An alternative translation is given to us in the footnotes of the ESV here. It says it could be a convener or a collector. This is literally someone who is gathering an assembly. He's gathering people together. And this name for a gathered assembly, exactly what we're doing here as we gather to worship today, the word in Greek is ecclesia. And so the gathered assembly that's gathered to hear the words of the preacher, this is the word by which we get the name of the book. Ecclesiastes is coming from ecclesia. It's saying we have gathered to hear the words of this preacher. The book is officially anonymous, but we have some good descriptors here, right? The preacher is the son of David, and he's the king of Jerusalem. So both Jewish and Christian scholars have long said that they believe this to be King Solomon, the direct son of David himself. The preacher describes himself as having great wisdom, great wealth, and within the opening couple of chapters. And so this identification with Solomon makes sense. We'll look into why that would be here in just a second. But it leads us to consider the question, did Solomon have the life experiences necessary that we would want to listen to his wisdom about life? Has he understood where we are here in the world? To really understand, should we listen to him, we got to look at the last chapter, though. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and in verse 11, we find this. It says, the words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. Ultimately, these are God's words spoken through Solomon. We trust them because God has inspired the book. Solomon's recognizing that this is God's wisdom, that these are things that God has conveyed to him, things that he's experienced, things that he's brought to mind. And so, yes, we trust every word because we know that the words are ultimately inspired by God. You know, for Solomon, wisdom was something he actually specifically asked for as well. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5, the Lord, he's appearing to Solomon in a dream by night, and God's asking, hey, what should I give you as you're becoming king? So Solomon, he recognizes that God has made him king in place of his father David, and that he's to lead God's people. And so he reads this in verse 9 of 1 Kings chapter 3. It says, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this your great people? It says, God, I'm just a young man. There's no way I'm going to lead your people. I need your wisdom in this. And the request pleased God greatly. And so he replies in verse 12 of 1 Kings 3. This is God speaking. He says, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I will give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. See, under Solomon's leadership, Israel began to prosper. Their wealth built. He was able to lead in many great building projects, most notably the building of God's temple in Jerusalem. And it's probably in this early part of Solomon's life that we have books like Proverbs, those written by him, and likely Song of Solomon. We looked at that was a very strong contender for the author of Song of Solomon when we went through it. This early part where he's really leaning into God's wisdom. But yet sin also begins to creep into Solomon's life. God's law to Israel had a lot of commands, but commands specifically for the kings as well. One said that the king should not build for him a mighty army, because if he does, he will no longer trust in God's provision for them. Instead, he'll trust in his army. Yet, by 1 Kings chapter 10, only 7 chapters after God grants him this wealth, Solomon had 1,400 chariots. He had 12,000 horsemen that he stationed in cities around his kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 10 also has a large section just describes the vast wealth that Solomon had, all the gold utensils and things that he would eat on. Deuteronomy 17:17 specifically commands the king not to acquire wives for himself. And he did so because it would cause their hearts to be turned away from God. We get to 1 Kings chapter 11. Now we're getting reports that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. This leads us to the fateful line that we see in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. It said, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not truly to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. God says, if you do this, this will lead you away from me. Solomon, in all of his great wisdom, does not listen. And by the end, the report is that his heart has been pulled away from faithfulness to God. In verse 9 of chapter 11, the Lord is angry with Solomon because he didn't keep the things commanded to him. So the result is that God would remove his hand of blessing from Solomon. He promised that he would tear his kingdom from him. So you go, was Solomon fit to write this book? Was he fit to give us wisdom about life? We don't know when he wrote this book, but it reads as someone that is late in their life, that is now reflecting upon all the decisions they've made, all the good things, all the mistakes that they've made, and he begins to give that to us. You know, many of you are likely familiar with the three circles. It's a visual way of describing the gospel. It's the gospel is simply just the good news of what Jesus has done. It begins with God's perfect creation there on the left circle. It says God dwells with man, and it says everything in God's creation was good. And to stay, man just needed to live according to God's design for the world. Just follow God's design. So if there was any man on this earth that may have had the potential of following God's design on this earth, would it not be the man that God has given such great wisdom to? Yet he, Solomon, like all of us, has departed from God's design, which has led us to the world that's now broken. This is the second circle you see. From this world of brokenness, we try one escape mechanism after another. We say maybe this will solve it. We hope that one of these is going to lead us back to God's perfect design. We've mentioned some of these escapes already today: distraction, pleasure, work, relationships, your possessions. So laid before us is Solomon reflecting upon his life. And he's saying something like this. He goes, I've explored every single one of these roads exhaustively. I've tried them all. But let me lay out for you a dependable plan by which you could follow, so you don't have to go on the same journey away from God that I have. I submit that Solomon has the life experiences and the wisdom from God to write this book for us. Which leads us to think about some vocabulary and themes that we're going to see in this book. Beginning in chapter 2 again, we see vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? The first word we have to look at, obviously, here is vanity. Other popular translations in English would mean meaningless or futile. It's a word that's going to get used 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a theme that opens the book, and it's going to be the theme that closes the book. In chapter 12, verse 8, it's the last verse before he gives just a little bit of a conclusion. And the very last verse in 12:8 is reading just like this one. These are bookends. Vanity of vanities. The Hebrew word behind it is havel, and it's a bit difficult to translate, hence why we get so many different translations from it. Literally, it would mean a vapor or a breath. Our life as a breath is a concept that's found elsewhere in Scripture. Take, for example, Psalm 39, verse 5. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Speaking to God, saying our life to you must seem like a breath. It's also picked up in James chapter 4, verse 14. For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. You've seen this? We've had cold days. You breathe out, you see a little bit of mist, and it just vanishes and moves. So the translation we're given here in the ESV is it's vain or emptiness, We can often associate this with the following of an idol. For example, in Jonah chapter 2, verse 8, he speaks to others who pay regard to vain idols. Or perhaps a more well-known passage for some of you, Proverbs chapter 31, verse 30. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. There it is. Beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. See, worshiping an idol is meaningless. Pursuing beauty in this life is a waste of time. It says created things, idols, cannot bring ultimate meaning in this life. That's what this word starts to bring out for us. It cannot bring satisfaction. The whole Old Testament, for the most part, was written in Hebrew. People went back and translated into Greek, which the New Testament is written in. The Greek translation used in this passage for havel is going to mean, it's translated as futile. And this very well could have inspired Paul as he's writing Romans chapter 8. In verse 21 there, he wrote, "For the creation was subjected to futility." So Paul's examining the world, just like Solomon is giving us to us. It says, this earth around us, it's futile. It doesn't mean anything. But not only did the preacher here use the word havel, he used the Hebrew superlative. He said, havel, havel. Every repetition, it elevates the word higher. You see this used elsewhere, like in the tabernacle. It was supposed to have the Holy of Holies, right? The most holy place. Or perhaps you remember the seraphim in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3, as they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." Every time they say it, it's elevating it even higher. Havel, havel, vanities of vanities. All is vanity. He's trying to emphasize it. And this next verse is going to bring more words that we need to understand as well. Verse 3 again says, "What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" So first, under the sun. This phrase is going to get used 29 times in this book. And it's a way in which the preacher is describing life here on earth. This is from the human perspective. It's not describing how God is at work in the world, right? It's not describing how there's beauty of things or the evidence of God's grace around us. It's describing the life that's lived east of Eden. East of Eden. If you go all the way back into the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 here. In the Garden of Eden, everything was good. Mankind lived in the presence of God. But after Adam and Eve, after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they've now sinned and moved from God's design, God tells them that men and women are going to experience a curse. The earth also is going to experience and is going to be cursed. God then says, now that they've disobeyed, what will keep them from eating from the tree of life? And to be having eternal life, but having it apart from me and my design. So he did this in chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 24. It says, "He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." This is how the world is being described under the sun. It's the world east of Eden. It's that away from God's perfect design. It's a land cursed. It's subject to futility and its meaninglessness. The next word that we've got to look at here is gain. Another acceptable translation here might be profit. It's a word that's unique to Ecclesiastes. It's going to occur 10 times. It occurs nowhere else in the Old Testament. The gain is what is left over. It's the surplus that's left at the end. If you've run a business or even a lemonade stand or anything, you had cost, and then at the end, if you did well, you had a surplus. You had gain. You had profit, right? To some extent, this is almost the opposite of vanity. And instead of just a vanishing mist, there is something that is left. But the material things of the world are not in and of themselves bad things. But if God's good things are then turned into means instead of the ends themselves, or when they turn from being means to being the end, there you go, that makes more sense. So if God's things are turned from being means to being the end, then they've moved to being sinful. And after all, you're not going to be able to take your fortunes with you when you die. preacher said, what does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? This word for toiling, it's translated as, or could be translated as labor. We're going to find it 23 times in this book. There is work, and maybe even working to the point of exhaustion. Yet the work for earthly things is found to be meaningless. We can contrast this to Paul's writing to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15:58. There he says, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. See, it's work that's striving for God's glory, for striving for his purposes. That's the work that's going to last. The last word I want to draw your attention to this morning is the word God. Now, in the first 11 verses, we did not find this word. We did not read it this morning. It's going to first appear a couple verses later in chapter 1:13. The Hebrew word for God here is used 40 times in the book. And every time it's mentioned, it's the word Elohim. It's a general term for God. It brings to mind the fact that he's a mighty God, that he's a creator, that he's exercising his sovereign power. But what it doesn't convey is a personal relationship, a connection. For that, we would have expected the word Yahweh. This is the word that God gave to Moses. But the fact that we have the word Elohim, this general term for God, instead of the personal Yahweh, kind of makes sense as we're picturing life under the sun here on this earth. Elohim is up there and we're here on earth, and everything here on earth is meaningless. So even that term is going to convey some of the distance that we can feel upon our own efforts here on the earth. So I think having an understanding of these terms is going to help us as we move through this book. And hopefully you're already seeing how his theme is getting laid out here. It's going to help us to understand and apply it to our lives. But for the rest of our time, I want to look at his opening argument here, his opening statement. How is he going to defend the fact that vanity of vanities, all is vanities? That was the statement in verse 2. In verse 3, the same thesis is now given as a question. What does man gain by toiling under the sun? What do you get? But this is what I want you to be able to see today. That our human endeavors are hopeless in fixing the brokenness in our world and our relationship with God. If there's anything that you get from today, this is what I want you to see, that our human endeavors are hopeless in fixing the brokenness that's in our world, and it's hopeless in fixing our relationship with God. And Solomon's going to give us 4 truths that are really going to underline this reality. The first is this: everything is the same. Verses 4 to 7, he's going to use these ancient, foundational elements of the earth to kind of start to drive this home. He's going to talk about earth, air, fire, and water. He's going to show us that nothing changes, but everything stays the same. First, the earth, in verse 4, it always remains. It says, babies are born, lives are lived, but life is a mist, and then we all face the certainty of death. But yet, through it all, the earth remains. Pastor and theologian Warren Wiersbe, he talks about history in this way. He says, the costumes and sets may change, but the actors in the script basically stay the same. The costumes and the sets, the surroundings may look a little bit different, but in the end, right, us as the people in the script, the things that we have to deal with here on the earth on a daily basis don't change. Generations come, generations go, and the problems that we face here on the earth continue to remain the same. In addition, the earth's dependability is really the basis for modern science, right? Everything is based off the fact that because the earth doesn't change, now we can come up with theorems and we can understand our world a little bit better. Otherwise, the laws of science could not be derived from anything. There's some good that is about the earth never changing. But then second, the sun in verse 5, it's pictured like a runner on a racetrack. Right? It rises in the east and it sets in the west, and then it circles back around the track to get around the earth, come back around to the other side so it can rise again in the east tomorrow. The wind in verse 6 is also blowing in a predictable pattern. It's going to blow from the north down through the south, and it's going to come right back up to the north and go again. When we have these phrases, the east and the west and the north and the south, now we have the totality of the earth that's now affected. This totality of the earth that remains the same. He goes on and says the sea and our water cycles that are mentioned in verse 7. Right? No matter how much it rains, no matter how much water seems to run down those rivers into the sea, it doesn't change. The seas don't fill up. The water is again taken up into the sky, where it then falls again as rain and runs back into the river, and we repeat the cycle. So viewed purely from our earthly perspective, the world does not change. Elsewhere, the Bible does teach that God obviously is indeed at work in the Bible, or here in the world. The rising of the sun each morning, the rains upon the earth, these are part of his design. These are part of his grace that's given to us. So we recognize them. But your work, though, every day when you get up, the things that you toil, the things that you strive for, they can't stop the sun setting tonight and rising again in the east tomorrow. Everything's the same. He goes on and says that nothing satisfies. This is verse 8. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. No matter what you have, it will not be enough. You say, if I could just have this thing, then I'll be happy. But once you get that thing, whatever it is, it's just going to bring more weariness. And now then, you're going to wish that there was something else. As we saw in the three circles, every escape that you attempt on your own out of brokenness only results in coming back into a world of brokenness. You know, John D. Rockefeller, he was a very wealthy man. In 1913, it's estimated his net worth was about $900 million. Doesn't top the list today. It's maybe even a little bit pedestrian compared to some people's wealth today. But at the time, in 1913, it represented 3% of the U.S. GDP. This is the total measure of all goods and services that we as a country have put out in a year. And he owned the equivalent of 3% of that. That's an equivalent net worth today of close to $700 billion. It's almost 3.5 times greater than the richest people on earth right now. That's the amount of wealth that he had. And he was famously asked a question. He said, how much is enough? You know what his answer was? Just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. He's 3.5 times more wealthy than the wealthiest people today. And they said, how much more do you need? Just a little bit. It's not satisfied. He had a desire, a passion for more. Nothing you will obtain will fully satisfy. It's not your wealth or possessions. It won't be your job. It's not your spouse or your kids. How you answer the question, if I could just have this, and it will satisfy, it won't. In fact, whatever that is, it's a burden that you're placing on it that it certainly cannot bear. Verse 8 teaches us that you won't be able to say enough. You won't be able to see enough things. You won't be able to hear enough. It says nothing satisfies. He goes on to defend his statements and says that nothing is new in verses 9 and 10. Solomon gives the well-known line in verse 9 here. It says, there's nothing new under the sun. By this, he can't mean that there's not been any new advancements, that we've not made progress. We've learned more about the world that we live in. Modern science has helped us to live longer and healthier lives. We can now communicate with people on the opposite side of the world as if they're in the house next to us or even the room next to us. We've even sent people out of our atmosphere and we've watched them walk on the moon. We've made some progress. We've made some advances. But what is meant by this is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Through all the technological advancements we've made, we still haven't solved the problem of human sin. We're the same group of sinners that we were before. We're disobeying in the exact same ways. And in fact, maybe some of our advancements have actually made it easier for us to sin and to depart from God's ways. See, nothing we can do makes a difference. Which is why he says nothing is new. Nothing is new. And then he says that no one is remembered in verse 11. No one is remembered. Now, there's some extent by which we remember, right? We have a recorded history that tells us what happened, and perhaps maybe we don't always listen to the lessons from those from before. I can read a biography of our second president, John Adams, about his quarrels and fights with his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. I go, it kind of looks like today a little bit. Like we haven't learned these lessons. Maybe you go, I do better. I do pretty well at this. If I ask you to tell me about your grandparents, my guess is you give me some names, where they lived, probably some things that they like, some maybe favorite things that you enjoyed doing with them. What about your great-grandparents? What do they like? What was their favorite foods? What did they enjoy doing? I can remember being at my grandparents' house, and the one thing she liked making for breakfast sometimes were these fresh biscuits. They cut the biscuits, spread some butter on it, and then they pour Karo syrup, that really thick, really sweet syrup, just like cover the biscuits in it. Like as a 7-year-old, you're like, this is great. You know the amount of sugar you just gave me on this plate. This is fantastic. This is a great breakfast, right? And I was speaking at her funeral a couple years ago, and I learned that the reason she liked eating the biscuits there, she learned it from her father. This is a man that I don't remember much. He was alive for some of my life, but I don't remember him that well. And I don't know where he learned to eat biscuits that way. Where did he think that Karo syrup was the condiment of choice for the biscuits? I don't know. But in the same way, those who come in later generations, they're not going to remember the things that we're living and the things that we're coming to as well. See, you won't live forever. And for most of us, you won't live long enough to make a meaningful difference in the world that's actually going to be remembered for the generations to come. You see, what you do here under the sun, it's vanity. It's here today, it's gone tomorrow. So this is the thing. For our lives here on earth, this is true. This is true if you are a Christian or if you're not. Every earthly thing you do here on this earth will not survive past death for you. You can't take your wealth of possessions with you. You can't take your relationships. Your experiences are going to be nothing after death. It says, Havel, Havel, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Now, I admit this is a pretty depressing topic and a pretty depressing thing to be thinking about. But it's an honest assessment of where we are in the world. How is the world that is around us? And if everything is vanity, if it's vanity of vanities, then how do we go about finding meaning in life? See, until we realize that there's nothing under the sun that can give us ultimate meaning, then it's impossible for us to get to the point where we can see where Jesus has changed everything. We must recognize that our work here on earth is futile. Once we recognize that nothing we do here is going to make a difference, only then can we see that the way to live a meaningful life, to have a meaningful existence, is to find satisfaction and contentment in God. It's just a contentment and a satisfaction that He's given to us. Ultimate meaning is only found in Christ Jesus. See, the good news is that this life under the sun is not all that there is. The Bible teaches us of a hope of a life that's to come. It's a life of ultimate meaning. Paul writes about it in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 24, and it's here that I mentioned earlier that we have this exact phrase in verse 21. This is Romans 8. I'm going to begin reading in verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility. Here it is, Havel. Creation is subject to Havel, to futility. It's not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons and the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. See, there it was. Verse 20. Our world today is filled with futility. It's vain, it's meaningless, but there's hope here. There's a glory that's going to be revealed, and when it is, the earth is going to be set free from its futility. It's going to be set free from the curse of corruption. It was into our lives here under the sun that Jesus entered. Here under the sun, he lived. He lived a pleasing life before God. And he died on the cross, taking the judgment that we deserve for disobeying and moving away from God's design. He took God's judgment and wrath in our place. And then he defeated death, and he rose again on the third day. See, Jesus' resurrection was the first fruits of a new heaven and a new earth. In this new world, life under the sun ceases to exist. And instead, we're made new, and our life is now lived under God, and God is now our sun. It's in this new world that there's no vanity. There's no meaninglessness anymore. The things that you do in this new world, this new heavens and new earth, they're no longer a mist or a vapor. It's because they're eternal. They never end. Our hope is in the day that is to come. So you say, do you want redemption from this life of vanity? If you want redemption from this life of vanity, you first have to recognize, really come to the place where you can see that everything you do here on earth is vanity. It has no meaning on its own. It's only once you're here you can look to Jesus as our hope. You can look to him to be able to get your meaning. It's through him that we have meaning and we have life.